After Biden suffered a major loss at the Supreme Court over his emergency vaccine order, the federal government is changing tactics to implement the mandate another way. The Biden administration announced it is withdrawing its emergency order mandating large employers to vaccinate or regularly test their workers for COVID-19 because the Supreme Court effectively blocked the directive. However, instead of abandoning the mandate, the government is instead pushing to implement it another way. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, announced its plan to formally withdraw the order on Wednesday. The agency is not dropping the rule entirely, however. It will remove the emergency temporary standard, but it plans to keep the order as a proposed rule. The original order would have impacted some 85 million Americans. The new memo says, OSHA is withdrawing the November 5, 2021 Emergency Temporary Standard, ETS, which was issued to protect the unvaccinated employees of large employers, 100 or more employees, from the risk of contracting COVID-19 by strongly encouraging vaccination. Biden's strategy here appears to be very similar to another time when he implemented an order that he admitted was not likely to pass constitutional muster. In August, he admitted that he didn't care if the order was struck down eventually, because the slow pace of the courts allowed him to implement it for a while anyway.
The bulk of the constitutional scholarship says that it's not likely to pass constitutional muster. But at a minimum, by the time it gets litigated, it will probably give some additional time while we're getting that $45 billion out to people.
Now it seems the same strategy is involved with implementing a vaccine mandate. After the initial emergency vaccine order was blocked by the Supreme Court, several companies, like Starbucks, announced that they were ending their vaccine requirements for employees. OSHA, however, has continued to pressure companies to keep or enact their own forced vaccination and testing policies. The memo goes on to say that the only change from the government's stance is to withdraw the vaccination and testing ETS as an enforceable emergency temporary standard. The agency makes it clear that OSHA is not withdrawing the ETS to the extent that it serves as a proposed rule. In other words, the Biden administration is attempting to permanently implement the vaccine order that was declared unconstitutional. Whether this new method will also be declared unconstitutional is yet to be determined. The White House seemed to admit that the initial emergency order from OSHA was essentially a loophole. Ron Klain, the White House chief of staff, retweeted an MSNBC host who called the OSHA rule the ultimate workaround for the federal government to require vaccinations. The Supreme Court and a lower federal court pointed to this retweet as evidence that Biden and his team intended to evade constitutional limits on government power. Justice Gorsuch wrote that Congress has the power to order vaccine mandates, however, it has chosen not to afford OSHA, or any federal agency, the authority to issue a vaccine mandate. He continued by acknowledging Ron Klain's retweet that the OSHA rule is a workaround. The Supreme Court ruled on January 13th to stay President Joe Biden's order at least until the Sixth Circuit can reach a decision on the case. The Daily Wire filed the first lawsuit in the Sixth Circuit hours after the order was released on November 4th, and appealed the case to the Supreme Court the next month following the Sixth Circuit's decision to lift a stay on the OSHA order. Daily Wire CEO Jeremy Boring said at the time that the lawsuit addresses whether the government has the authority to force private companies and individuals to comply with the vaccine and testing order.
A question here isn't whether or not the government has the right to enforce its rules on its own employees. It's whether or not unelected bureaucrats at OSHA have the right to coerce private businesses into forcing private employees to follow rules that the government never had the right to impose in the first place. At the end of the day, the government does have the power to make us all comply, but they don't have the right to make us all comply. And that's why we have to keep fighting.
After filing its lawsuit in November, the Daily Wire launched a petition against Biden's order that gained over 1 million signatures before Christmas and continues to accept new signatures. The Supreme Court's decision to hear oral arguments in the case was rare and emphasizes the sweeping impact Biden's order could have if it were implemented. The last time the Supreme Court granted a motion to hear oral arguments over a stay or emergency pause on a government order was in a case from 1970. Sixth Circuit Chief Judge Jeffrey Sutton pointed out in December that the scope of Biden's vaccine mandate is unprecedented in the history of the United States. Sutton wrote that Biden's mandate goes far beyond regulating workplace hazards, which is the topic that OSHA is supposed to oversee. It is one thing to tell a worker to don a mask at the start of a hazard-filled shift and doff it at the end. It is quite another to tell a worker to vaccinate on the basis of a risk that exists whether he is on the clock or off, and that amounts to a medical procedure that cannot be removed at the end of the shift. After the Supreme Court blocked Biden's vaccine order, Daily Wire CEO Jeremy Boring celebrated the decision that affirmed the constitutional limits on the federal government.
Together, we kick the government's ass. Today, the Supreme Court decided by a huge majority of 6-3 to stay the Biden administration's unconstitutional private employer vaccine mandate. It's just a tremendous day for the American people, and a tremendous day for the founding idea that this is a limited government of enumerated powers which exists to protect, not erode, the God-given freedoms of the people.
And while the recent Supreme Court decision stands as a monumental victory for freedom, Biden and the rest of the federal government are continuing to implement its order, even if it will eventually be struck down. For the latest updates on Biden's continued vaccine mandate and the stories of Americans who do not comply, go to dailywire.com. I'm Brett Cooper. Thanks for watching.